The International Automobile Federation introduced a new guideline immediately after the opening race of the season, aiming to change the flexibility of the rear wing. The governing body expressed its dissatisfaction with what was observed during the first event, even though it had initially considered that a gap of 2,000 millimeters in the slot opening would be sufficient. Now that margin will be reduced by more than 75%, affecting certain teams more significantly, and above all, confirming the criticisms raised by Red Bull from the beginning. There is no doubt that the most controversial subject of the season of 2024 has been the flexibility of both the front and rear wings. However, the latter have generated even greater controversy since McLaren managed to exploit a considerable advantage on circuits with low aerodynamic load, such as the one in Baku, after being caught engaging in that practice. On that occasion, the guideline stipulated that, with a symmetrical load of 750 newtons, the slot opening could reach 2,000 millimeters. Even so, Red Bull expressed its concern during the pre-season tests in Bahrain that the phenomenon, known worldwide as mini DRS, would reoccur in 2025. Pierre Wash expressed his unease with the fact that teams such as McLaren and Ferrari found ways to further exploit the rules. After the event in Melbourne, it became clear that the Federation shared the same apprehensions. When analyzing the records, it may be difficult to notice the flex seen in Baku, as it appears subtle to the naked eye. However, close-up images and comparisons reveal that even under aerodynamic force, the wing still flexes, exactly what the new regulation intends to prevent. Starting with the Grand Prix in China, the full rule will be enforced in Suzuka, where no tolerance will be accepted. In China, however, there will be a small margin, considering the short prior notice for the rule's implementation. Thus, this weekend, a permitted deflection of 0.5 millimeters with a margin of 0.2 millimeters will be observed. But in Suzuka, that margin of 0.25 millimeters will be eliminated, setting the maximum opening of the slot space at 0.5 millimeter. A crucial point to note is that the distance between the main plane and the flap, now reduced to 0.5 millimeters, must be measured only when a vertical load of 75 kilograms is applied to either end of the main plane of the rear wing. Without a doubt, some teams will be more affected than others, and according to Red Bull, McLaren and Ferrari are among the most disadvantaged. One only needs to look at the image of the rear wing of the MCL39 to determine whether it complies with the new parameters. The Federation gathered a vast amount of evidence that supported the regulatory change, as expressed in an article dated 2025. It stated that if a vertical load of 75 kilograms is applied to either end of the main plane of the rear wing, the variation in the distance between the main plane and the flap should not exceed 2,000 millimeters. For the next Grand Prix in Shanghai, that limit will drop to 0.5 millimeter, with an added margin of 0.25 millimeter. The teams were informed of this revised test on the morning of Monday, the 17th of March, and the Federation confirmed that during the Melbourne event, all cars evaluated according to the criteria of Article 3.1, 5.17 were in compliance. Thus, every vehicle that competed in Melbourne was considered legal. In light of this scenario, it is important to recall the statements made by Pierre Wash during the pre-season tests, when he was the first to warn that some teams were still exploiting the mini DRS rule. In press interviews, he stated that the practice was still ongoing and, in his view, Ferrari and McLaren continued to benefit from this loophole. Recent reports, including optimistic comments from the Red Bull camp and Helmut Marko, suggest that narrowing the gap compared to McLaren is a very real possibility once the new guideline is applied. According to information, the Austrian veterans reported that the initial margin in the pre-season tests was half a second, but in the race in Australia they managed to reduce that interval to between 2 and 3 tenths. For that reason, optimism prevails, and the restriction on the rear wings may trigger an intense battle for the Drivers' Championship. The cameras installed on the cars during the free practice sessions in Australia did a remarkable job. The situation is inevitably turning against McLaren and Ferrari, who are the main suspects of misusing the mini DRS loophole. Although it is not clear whether this practice is the primary source of their advantage, it is worth noting that, when analyzing the maximum speeds, Norris was recorded with a speed 11 kilometers per hour lower than that of the fastest car, while Piastri was right behind Leclerc. Even so, the first two positions belong to Ferrari and McLaren, which may be a coincidence following the federation's latest decision. It is certain that these two teams will be under intense media scrutiny, since even though there is a deflection tolerance of 0.25 mm, meaning that the federation will allow up to 0.75 mm of deflection in the rear wings, it will be interesting to verify whether this is the only factor that McLaren uses to gain an advantage. After all, the overall performance of the MCL39 appears satisfactory, and the change in the rear wing regulation may not be enough to drastically reduce the car's performance. It might seem that the federation's latest intervention was motivated by McLaren's dominance, but there are strong arguments suggesting otherwise. Both Ferrari and Sauber adopted the same strategy of maximum space, which shows that the space was never intended to be used as an aerodynamic element, but rather for the activation system of the DRS. This interpretation reinforces that taking advantage of the space for aerodynamic gains goes against the spirit of the regulations. It is worth remembering that, in the race in Hungary of 2023, Aston Martin presented a technically compliant rear wing, but was disqualified for violating that regulatory spirit. The fact that the federation intervened after stating that all the cars in Melbourne were legal shows that the gap of 2,000 millimeters for the rear slot was no longer considered acceptable. This demonstrates that even with such small deflections and gaps, as shown in earlier images, the aerodynamic advantage can be extremely significant, being the main reason for the immediate imposition of restrictions on the rear wings. We must also mention the remarkable progress made by the Woking BANS squad, which managed to gain up to 15 seconds over the Sten in a very short period under mixed conditions. The expectation was that the SF25 with a higher load would perform better in rainy conditions, since McLaren prepared the car more for qualifying than for the race. However, that advantage was reflected on both Saturday and Sunday. Max Verstappen was the first to comment on the impressive tire advantage of the Woking BANS squad compared to the others, highlighting the difficulty of overtaking McLaren and mentioning the challenges faced with tire overheating and degradation. This situation became even more evident with the intermediate tires, as the compound is softer compared to the slick tires, which allows for better temperature control and easier separation. Keeping the tires within an optimal performance range will be decisive. In summary, the focus in China will be on Ferrari and McLaren, in addition to the fact that all teams will have only one practice session to adjust their cars for both the sprint qualifying and the sprint itself. This situation may influence how the cars are set up for qualifying and for the main event. The conditions in China will be diametrically opposed to those in Australia, due to the dry weather and high temperatures, which will allow teams such as Mercedes to also benefit and deliver a striking performance under these circumstances. Additionally, Ferrari seeks to project a more competitive image in China, as Vasseur stated, emphasizing that its true capability will be revealed in Shanghai. In view of all this, do you believe that Red Bull has achieved its objective by maintaining consistency in the restriction of the rear wings in relation to the federation? Furthermore, in your view, will McLaren and Ferrari face significant difficulties with the new regulation?